Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back, my dear sisters. This is UK Islamic Missions Ramadan 2025 series, 30 juz in 30 days. So before we go any further, same housekeeping rules. Please make sure your microphones are off, your cameras are off, and that you are in a good headspace and a good environment to listen and reflect, inshallah. For those who were not with us on the previous days, my name is Dr. Batul Wali. I am going to be your host and your speaker for today and for the coming week. And then, inshallah, we have some excellent speakers lined up. We are covering one juz a day, and today is day 3, inshallah. So we will be doing juz 3. And essentially, we're finishing off a little bit of Surah Baqarah and then moving on to Surah Ali Imran. So without further ado, we'll just get started. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. The same overview of sessions, so we'll just do a quick recap of the theme, do some recitation of the Quran, and then begin reflecting on the verses. So just for those sisters who haven't been with us the previous few days, the theme this year is relationships. So the idea being, how can I improve my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how will that feed down to improve my relationships with other people? And as we look at these verses, you will see that we are not taking every single verse, and we are not trying to derive every single lesson, because obviously the Quran has so much depth. Instead, we are looking at these verses from the lens of what can I take from this that will benefit me specifically in my relationships with other people. And then on that note, we will begin with recitation of Quran. So we will start with the opening verses of Surah Ali Imran, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم نزل عليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه وأنزل التوراة والإنجيل من قبل هدى للناس وأنزل الفرقان إن الذين كفروا بآيات الله لهم عذاب شديد والله عزيز ذو انتقام إن الله لا يخفى عليه شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء هو الذي يصوركم في الأرحام كيف يشاء لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Okay, inshallah. So we'll begin with Juz 3, and essentially I keep coming back to this, but we are reflecting. So we are not deep diving into the academics too much this week. We're not deep diving too much into the roots of words and really going and touching on lots and lots of resources. Inshallah, I imagine that will be coming in the coming weeks. But for the next few sessions, I really want you and everyone here and myself to reflect on how I can apply these verses to my life. So really this is an exercise in reflection. We'll start with verse 254 of Surah Baqarah. O believers, donate from what we have provided for you before the arrival of a day when there will be no bargaining, friendship or intercession. Those who disbelieve are truly the wrongdoers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the scene on the day of resurrection, and it's an interesting sequence, because normally you either rely on yourself, you rely on your close friends, or you rely on someone you know who's in the know, and that's intercession. And so it makes you think about the role of friendship itself, sisters. So we have different types of friendship, right? We have those who are our friends for financial support. I'm not talking about true friends. True friends are very different. But in terms of acquaintances, people we know, those who we know primarily for financial support. Those who we know primarily for psychological support. So those are the people we ring just to vent, to get everything out of our system. We have friends that are our friends because we exercise with them. They help us lose weight. We go running club with them, whatever it might be. There are those who we are friends with because they are our moral support. In difficult times, they're the person you ring and you don't vent, you listen to them and you hear what to say, because they are our moral support. And as far as modern friendship goes, modern culture encourages us very heavily to sort of drop whoever doesn't uplift you. If they're not being positive about everything, just drop them. Even if you are making negative decisions, if they're not encouraging you towards that, then they're no good. And so we have these different types of friends. And in this world, your friends can support you in everything. Like I said, you might be doing something bad or evil and they can still support you. And it comes back to that point that we raised in a previous session. Just because you like someone doesn't mean that they are good for you. Just because you like someone, just because you vibe well with them, they're a good friend, doesn't mean they are good for you. Does that mean we can't be friends with anyone because everyone has flaws? No. What we need to hone in on, sisters, is the overall trajectory of the relationship. What do I mean by that? Every single person has flaws. You're not going to only get good from someone, but you need to look at overall, on balance, is there more good than bad? Overall, on balance, is this relationship helping me towards Jannah? Look how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions friends specifically in the context of the day of resurrection. And so that is important, that we focus on where is that relationship taking us. Will we be satisfied with the relationship that we're having now when it comes to the future? And so with that in mind, as we carry on and we discuss various aspects of maintaining relationships and trying to make things work, we have to look at things in a critical eye, because what happens in Ramadan, subhanallah, is that we have iftars, we do spend time with other people, but a lot of our self-growth happens by ourselves. It is our personal ibadah. It is, I'm switching off from the world, I'm taking more time away from my phone, and I'm focusing on my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is great until Ramadan ends, and then you throw yourself back into the same context around the same people, and then you wonder why things aren't going so great. So that first verse that we touched upon, the reason why I put it in and the reason why I want everyone to reflect on it is to reflect on who you have in your life. Are they beneficial? Are they taking you the right direction? Now, moving away from that, I have a question to ask everyone. Very simple question. If something is dead, can it come back to life? If something is dead, completely dead, can it come back to life? So as Muslims, obviously, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring the dead back to life. And in the end of Surah Baqarah, there is an interesting story which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about. I've put it verbatim on the screen, but I will paraphrase for the sake of ease of understanding, that essentially a man went past a city that was completely destroyed, and he began thinking in his mind, Could Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring this city to life after it was completely destroyed? So as a lesson, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused that man to die for hundreds of years and then brought him back to life. And when he brought him back to life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked him, so how long have you remained like this? And he said, well, maybe a day, a part of a day. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala corrects him that you have been here for hundreds of years. Look at your food and look at the remains of your donkey. Now, it says at the end, the man then said and declared, now I know that Allah is most capable of everything. As Muslims, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring the living from the dead and the dead from the living. The interesting thing about this story, there's a few things I want to touch upon. One, note that his food and drink remained unspoiled, so that they hadn't rotted, but the donkey died and was brought back to life. One thing we can learn from this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to bring things back to life in any stage, at any time, in any way that he pleases. He wanted the food to remain unspoiled, so it remained unspoiled. He wanted the donkey to die, it died and came back to life. I hope that makes sense. Think about this in the context of relationships. Think about this in the context of relationships where you have estrangement, where there's someone that you haven't spoken to 10, 15, 20, 30 years. In the context of your child who recently has become very hostile, doesn't want anything to do with you, you haven't spoken to them in 2 years. Or a relative or a friend that you're not in good terms with anymore. Sometimes we look at certain relationships and we think that relationship is gone. That relationship could never be mended. But why do we think like that? One of the premises of our beliefs is that we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring the living from the dead. And so we need to, as we go through the next month and we talk about relationships and we look at the whole Quran, don't dismiss anything. Don't think, oh, these are great lessons for this situation, but not for that one because that one has died. That relationship is dead. No. We shall all be open-minded, inshallah. And that's why I popped this verse in, to encourage us to think about everything. Don't dismiss anything. Now, after this point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes a lot about charity. And we spoke about charity in previous sessions, that the importance of giving and how it brings relationships together. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically teaches us about the etiquettes of giving. Kind words and forgiveness are better than charity followed by injury. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's several verses sort of describing this idea of giving with generosity and not following it up with hurtful words. So that's verse 262. Kind words and forgiveness are better than charity followed by injury. Verse 263, Surah Baqarah. And then it carries on, actually. There are, like I said, there's several verses about this. Verse 264, again, don't waste your charity with reminders of your generosity or hurtful words. So the idea that you give someone something and then 1 week, 2 months, 3 years, 5 years down the line, you throw it back in their face. That you say, oh, I was the one who gave you such and such. Oh, you're acting like you're so independent, so this and that, but I'm the one who gave you such and such thing on such and such occasion. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a beautiful sort of metaphor that makes it a lot easier to understand. He says, their example is that of a hard, barren rock covered with a thin layer of soil hit by strong rain, leaving it as bare stone. Such people are unable to preserve the reward of their charity. So essentially, it's being described that you have this smooth rock with only a little bit of soil on it, and then the rain comes and washes that away as well. Nothing can grow there. You've given this little bit of charity, you claim it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so you've got that little bit of soil, and then you say these awful words to people, and then that's it. Your charity is almost gone. Why is the etiquette of giving so important? Because it is intertwined with our relationship with other people. When we say certain things, sisters, it hurts and people remember. If we were to speak to everyone right now, each of you could probably give me an example of something someone said to you. If I said 5 years ago, I'm sure that we would all be able to think of something 5 years ago, and even more than 5 years ago, that something someone said that hurt us. And this behavior is damaging because you're humiliating the person. You're humiliating them, that I gave you such and such. Whereas in Islam, when you look at the principles of Sharia, it is about honor. It is about protecting. It's about protecting the life, the property, and the honor of a person. And so if you're in a financially better situation than someone else, that doesn't mean you can dishonor them. And that's what we're learning about the etiquettes of giving. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives another rule in terms of giving. Donate from the best of what you have earned and of what we have produced for you from the earth. Don't pick out worthless things for donation. Such things that you would only accept with closed eyes. And then what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Allah is self-sufficient and praiseworthy. And again, we come back to this idea that when we understand Allah's names properly, it impacts the way that we interact with other human beings. When you understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is self-sufficient, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need us to give charity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is completely self-sufficient. Allah is all bountiful. Allah is the one who has and provides. Therefore, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need our charity, why are we giving it? We are giving it for the reward. So why would we not give the best of what we have? Don't be miserly with people. Don't be cheap. Don't be stingy. And don't think that people are less than you. Everything you have when it comes to wealth is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think it's a case of life. If you speak to enough people, you learn a lot of things. There are a lot of very well-off people who used to be homeless. And there's a lot of people who were well off and now are struggling. This is all part of the rhythm of being alive. That sometimes one person has more, one person has less. It is not a marker of status. And it means if you're in a position to give, it doesn't make you better than. And therefore give out the best of what you have. And when we start doing this, inshallah, we'll start feeling that sweetness in our relationships. Because if you're going through life thinking you're better than other people because of something you have, it creates anxiety because you're then very anxious to hold on to that thing. You can't imagine not having that wealth. And then it creates like discord and hardness between the hearts of people. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on and he says, He grants wisdom to whoever He wills, and whoever is granted wisdom is certainly blessed with a great privilege. Now the question is, what is wisdom? Wisdom is very interesting when you look at the tafsir. Wisdom is not about degrees and these sorts of things. Wisdom, actually, there's multiple layers to this, but the one I want to focus in on is wisdom has some relation to our relationships. The person who's wise benefits from the advice of those who are sound of mind and good comprehension. I will put it more into layman's terms so it's easier for us to understand. Wisdom is about being able to take the advice of others, understanding what other people are saying, taking the good from it, applying it to your own life, being open to that good advice, to change, being receptive to other people. That's what wisdom is, because wisdom is an ongoing process. It's not that you're just wise for 1 second and then you're not. The idea of having wisdom is that you are able to improve, and you can only improve if you recognize your own weaknesses and you change. So you have to be receptive to what other people say, but we can't be receptive, sisters, if we think we're better than people. If we think we're better than people, if we're arrogant, if we have that in our heart that, no, I know what I'm doing. I'm on my own journey. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to hear X, Y, and Z again. I know what I'm doing. You're not going to make progress. And on that note, in a general kind of that is more of an individual picture, but on a general view, as a society, how do human beings learn things? Through social interactions. And that means that our elders can learn from our youth. The world is changing. The youth are growing up in that world. Our young people have things that they can explain to our elders, and likewise, our young people can learn from the elderly. And so this generational discourse is important, and that's why it's important that we are close to each other, that parents are close to their children, that grandparents are close to their grandchildren, so that you have that flow of knowledge and advice, and that we can benefit and we can grow. Then we get to verse 272. It goes on in terms of this discussion about charity and how charity is actually for our own good, like we mentioned about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being self-sufficient. The discourse about charity continues on. And then we get to this point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet, essentially, he's addressing the Prophet, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, you are not responsible for people's guidance. It is Allah who guides whoever He wills. Sisters, I'm about to deep dive into something which I hope will be of benefit to a lot of people. And it's a little bit nuanced, so I'd appreciate it if we all try and pay attention to this. Because it's the idea of encouraging someone to change and taking responsibility for their change. Those two are not the same. And if you overlap them, you'll find a lot of stress for your own self. You'll find a lot of strain on your relationships, because in general, it's good if we alleviate the responsibility of other people from our own heads and our own hearts. Because you can't force anyone to change. You can't control other people. And as simple as that sounds, if we start reflecting on our relationships, we realize that we do it more than we intend to. We don't wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to control exactly what my spouse or my children or my friend is going to do. We don't think like that. But behavior, the way we behave, speaks otherwise. I'll give you an example with regards to marriage, for example. We see this a lot amongst sort of the young people, that they have a lot of strain within their relationship because they go into marriage thinking that they'll be able to completely change the other person. They just presume, maybe because it's married life and it's different, and they just think, oh, this person's okay in this way, but I'll change this bit and I'll change that bit. But you can't change people. And think about being on the receiving end of that. How it feels when you can tell that someone else is trying to manipulate you, or someone else is disapproving of certain aspects of you but approving of others. It's not a nice feeling. It's suffocating. And when you make someone feel suffocated, sisters, they don't respond positively. They'll either completely withdraw, or they'll meet you up front and it will be very heated and very argumentative. And from a religious point of view, it's not fair. We can't force someone to change, even for goodness. We can't force someone to change, because when you are forcing them almost into servitude of you, which obviously is completely wrong, because Islam is about submission to Allah, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us that free will. When we take that responsibility off of us, when we stop thinking it is our responsibility and we have to control someone in that way, it takes the agitation out of relationships. It stops making everything a battlefield and aggressive, when we accept that the overall outcome is not our responsibility. Now, here's the nuance. Does that mean we don't try? Does that mean, well, oh, I sort of told my child that they shouldn't go out and smoke, but they're still smoking, but khair, it's not my responsibility. They can do whatever they like. Does that mean that, oh, I told my spouse to wake up for Fajr, but he's still sleeping, he doesn't listen, but I've told him now it's not my responsibility? Does that mean that when we have relatives who may not be wearing hijab, we just say it once and then we leave it? No. What it does mean is we don't get frustrated when things don't change. We do our bit. We keep saying in the best of ways, we think about the person and how they might be most receptive to change. We do all of those things. We keep going, we keep going, we keep going. And we will be more able to keep going because we don't get frustrated. We understand that the outcome being any discernible change, is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our job is just to keep going. Our job is to do the action. So I hope that makes sense. And I think if we can implement this in this one verse into our relationships on all levels, there will be a sigh of relief in us, and we will feel more at peace, and we will know that the actions that we are doing to try and help other people make progress alongside ourselves, those actions are witnessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our reward is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the outcome is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time to really deep dive into that, because I do think that this one verse could completely change the nature of our relationships with other people. Surah Baqarah carries on and then goes straight into discussing money and interest. And so many of you might be thinking, what does interest have to do with relationships? And I would say that money matters, and I think money probably is one of the biggest issues within a lot of relationships. When you speak to people who may not be speaking to someone in their family or a friend, a lot of the time it's because of a financial issue. And so it's a beautiful thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put this in Surah Baqarah so that we can learn and we can navigate those situations, and that we can look at money in a healthy way. If we become obsessed with making money, something can happen to our mind. We can look at someone who is in need of money and give them a loan and ask for interest back on it. And interest is one of those things that has been so normalized in our culture that because credit cards, everything is on interest nowadays if you want it to be. And it's so normalized that we actually forget how morally corrupt it is. Interest is completely haram, and on a visceral level, we should be able to understand that, because you are looking at someone in need and saying, I'll help you, but I want to make a profit off of it. How obsessed does a person have to be with money and making money that honestly that they would utilize someone else's need in that way? And that's why, amongst other reasons, it is completely haram, and that we should not be contributing to that system at all. We should wipe our hands clean of such a morally corrupt system. It is a system based on greed. And so when you look at the verse, fear Allah and give up outstanding interest if you're true believers. And if you don't, beware of a war with Allah and His Messenger. This is how strongly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala words it here. And alongside this mentality of absolute greed, it then begins affecting all of our relationships. It affects everything. And we see it even within our own communities, that as interest gets normalized, what else do you see? You see a poverty mindset. You see parents kicking out their kids at 18 years. As soon as they hit 18 years, khalas, kick them out and say they're self-sufficient. That's it. They'll manage by themselves. Why? But I'm not objecting to teaching your children how to manage in the real world. That's fine. What am I objecting to is minimizing your input in your child's life purely for financial reasons. That's completely inappropriate. It's entirely a poverty mindset that you don't want to spend one more penny on them. And then when we look at the divorces, look at the divorce rates. Again, you will hear so many speakers talk about how high the divorce rates are, but we need to reflect on ourselves as a community as to why. Why are the divorce rates so high? What is the role of a husband and what is the role of a wife? And how many women are fulfilling the role of a wife, and how many women are not fulfilling the role of a wife and are working and only working? And I want everyone to remain open to what I'm saying, because I'm not criticizing the women per se for working. The people I'm actually criticizing is the fact that so many sisters feel like they have to work and they have to get a degree, because what if something happens in my marriage? Then how am I going to support myself? When you speak to a lot of sisters, this is what it falls back on, and then that reflects a shortcoming in the men of our society. Where are the fathers, the brothers, the uncles? Where are their mahram? Why don't they feel they can rely on these people? What is happening with our relationships? So when it comes to money, money is very pivotal to a lot of relationships. And this poverty mindset, this mindset that I have to count every penny, has seeped into us because we have become lax about interest itself. And it is affecting everything. Is affecting the relationship with our relationship with our children, because actually we don't really want to spend very much on them. And then likewise, our children grow up and actually they don't really want to spend too much on us. Is affecting the marital home, because so many women feel like they have to work, which is very different to wanting to work or wanting to contribute to society. They feel obligated to work because they don't think they can rely on their husband, or they don't feel like they can rely on whoever the mahram is in their situation. This is what happens when we don't treat money in the correct way and we don't have this generous giving mentality. And so that sort of leads us to the end of Surah Baqarah, and we're on to Surah Ali Imran. We recited the first few verses at the beginning of this talk, and now I want to hone in on one of the verses that says, "Say, O Prophet, if you sincerely love Allah, then follow me. Allah will love you and forgive your sins, for Allah is all forgiving, most merciful." I think we live in an era where if you want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is a lot of directions you can take. There are lots of spiritual retreats. Some people have taken up meditation, therapies, a lot of very complicated ways. And I think it's very important that this Ramadan in particular, because like I said, it's become very normalized. And for some people it works, which is great. But for some people are very much overcomplicating things for themselves. They've got their mood boards, they've got their little books, their journals, everything. And like I said, for some people it works, but for a lot of people, we need to just hone it right back. The most direct route to getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through loving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and following his sunnah. And so the question really is, if we are feeling a little bit distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ramadan's just started, we're starting to get into the rhythm of things. Maybe there are a lot of things this past year that we're not too proud of, and we're really trying to redirect our lives. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us all. Then one of the things we can do is start implementing the sunnah into our lives, the little things that we can do, and it will help us get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we've seen throughout these sessions, getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then have a knock-on effect in all of our relationships. This inshallah should be quite interesting, and I think it teaches us a lot about people, a lot about our own psychology. There's a story at the beginning of Surah Ali Imran. It talks about the wife of Imran, when she became pregnant, essentially, she said, "My Lord, I dedicate what is in my womb entirely to your service, so accept it from me." And then eventually she delivered a baby girl, and she says, "My Lord, I have given birth to a girl, and Allah fully knew what she had delivered, and the male is not like the female." I think this story is so interesting and so profound, because the wife of Imran said, "I dedicate what is in my womb entirely to your service." I think let's look at it overall. Firstly is the idea of having a dream for our children, having a lofty dream for them, having a religious aim for them. Not just, I want them to become this profession and that profession. They should do that as well. But also, I want them to be righteous, to be good, to be generous, to be kind to the people. I want people to meet my child and then make dua for my child because my child was so good to them. We should have religious aims for our children. And then this one particular line that I alluded to, "I dedicate what is in my womb entirely to your service." The idea that throughout pregnancy, a woman is essentially growing a child in her womb. Whatever she eats, whatever she does, her whole body is sending nutrients towards this child who's growing in there. And the wife of Imran is saying that this thing that I'm growing with all my energy, I dedicate it to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it makes you think, what is in us? What is in us that we can dedicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What are our abilities? What is our skills? What are our natural talents? What are the things that we have in us? What are the things that we have dedicated time to grow? What skills are we growing? What in us and in our life that we have invested effort and energy in that we can now dedicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because we all have something. Maybe it's more obvious for some people, less obvious for some other people. Maybe you might feel that it's small, maybe it is a huge talent. It doesn't matter what it is. Take whatever it is that you have dedicated your life to and find a way to use it in the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then after that, she gave birth to a girl and she was almost surprised, but Allah knew. And essentially we need to have dreams and aims, and we need to be accepting of Allah's plans at the same time. Because especially when it comes to our relationship with our children, we sometimes have the opposite problem where we have huge aims for them, but actually they might not be able to exactly do that. They might not exactly have that inside of them, and that's okay as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fully knew what she had delivered. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the capabilities and the abilities of your child and can raise them up based on their abilities. And then again, the male is not like the female. We touched on this last session. Allah gives how He pleases to whoever He pleases. The genders are different biologically. Make of that what you will. The male is not like the female, but that doesn't necessarily mean. It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give to whoever He wills whatever He wills. And that is part of our Islam, and that we are satisfied with that. Then it continues on. He exclaimed, "My Lord, how can I have a son when I am very old and my wife is barren?" So this is a very human mindset, thinking about all the obstacles, all the logistical ways. How can this outcome happen if this, and this? Because our knowledge is limited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, so will it be. Allah does what He wills. When it comes to fertility and children, this is a very touchy subject within our community. It's not something we speak openly about because of modesty, but I just want to touch about it ever so slightly, because I know there are a lot of families and a lot of people who deal with these issues, and it is very stressful. It's very stressful. But ultimately what we learn from this is that it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we should not put a huge amount of pressure on yourself And in fact, it is about making dua, and it is about trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decision on the matter. We make dua for what we want, but in our heart we are content with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides. The same way, like in the previous verse, she made dua, she gave birth to a girl. But that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decision, and there was wisdom in that. So for those who are struggling with these issues, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you patience. And inshallah, all of these things are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who gives. And it is important that you don't put that stress upon yourself. And the reason why I'm mentioning it in the context of these sessions is because it affects relationships. If you become stressed about these matters and shaitan distorts it in your mind and you put pressure on yourself and your spouse, it will then begin to affect your relationship. Then we kind of fast forward a little bit and we come to the verse that is concerning Maryam. She said, "My Lord, how can I have a child when no man has ever touched me?" So this is regarding the birth of Isa alayhi salam. And the angel replied, "So will it be. Allah creates what he wills." And the reason why I put in this specific verse, "How can I have a child when no man has ever touched me?" is because of sadly a new issue we're seeing within the community that is becoming rampant. And I will just really ask this question: how many women today, how many young girls today can say this? Because there was a time where basically every single young girl could comfortably say this, that no man has ever touched me. That seems to be changing now. And the fact of the matter is that is something that needs to be preserved. Because later Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Maryam, "Surely Allah has selected you, purified you, and chosen you over all women in the world." So what do we learn from this? Everything about Maryam is good. It's selected. It is amongst the qualities that made her chosen over all women in the world. So although we live in a society that says actually zina and these things don't really matter, it doesn't determine your worth, and I'm not saying, we live in a society that minimizes this sin. And I think it's important in a space where there are only sisters that we are clear that actually not only is it a sin, it affects your heart. And actually preserving your chastity is important. It affects your ability to bond with your spouse later in life when you're married. All of these things are true. All of the commandments we receive in the Quran help us maintain healthy and good relationships. And so there's a lot to be said on this topic. But I think if you are struggling with these things, maybe just this one verse is enough. That the best woman in the world was able to say, "How can I have a child when no man has ever touched me?" And that is something that we should all strive to attain in that sense. Then the verses continue discussing Isa alayhi salam and the disciples, and then we have this verse regarding honesty. And it talks about the people of the book. Why do you mix the truth with falsehood? It's a criticism of the people of the book. There's a lot of criticisms by this point, but this one really stood out. Because actually we are a nation with the truth. We have the truth. We have the Quran. And the question really is, how much are we holding up to it and how much do we mix up? How much do we practice as is and how much do we kind of blend to make it more palatable? How many celebrations are we taking from other cultures and other religions? Even when we are naming our children, do we name them honorable names or do we try to give them something so they will blend in a little bit more? How much are we trying to just soften the edges? Even though we have the truth, even though we have something that's good for all of humanity. The verse in question was actually to do with people at the time would pretend to be Muslim at the beginning of the day and then convert at the end of the day just to confuse people. They never really fully entered into the religion. And there are more verses of this nature in Surah Imran. There's verses talking about people of the scripture who would twist their tongues to almost make it seem like what they're saying is part of the scripture when it's not. They say it is from God when it is not. They attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lies whilst they know it. So this concept of honesty is mentioned again and again at the beginning of Surah Ali Imran. And the reason why I wanted to mention it is because when you take a bit of this and a bit of that, it begins to ruin relationships. It's completely inappropriate because you're lying against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we do it in a religious context. But when we do that same sort of behavior just in our general life when we're not upright, you'll find you might get away with it at first, but slowly it erodes your relationships with people. And when we do this in a religious context, when we're celebrating Eid one day and Christmas the next, people will look at you and they will think that is what Islam is. Whether we like it or not, the reality of the matter is that we represent the religion wherever we go, and we should try our best to uphold a certain standard for ourselves. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. And then we go on to verse 75, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there are some people amongst the book who, if you entrusted them with a stack of gold, they would readily return it. And there are others, if you gave them a single coin, they would not repay it unless you constantly demand it. And I just wanted to put that in because when we talk about honesty, that also sort of bleeds into the idea of discrimination. That actually we should be honest with ourselves that not all people are the same. Not all people of one group are the same. We have general ideas, but within one group, people can have differing natures. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us that as well. That we have all of these sort of general ideas about people, but there are nuances. And we should open our heart to those nuances. We shouldn't remain stubborn. And then it continues on and it talks about people who sell out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's covenant and their own oaths for a small price. What does it mean to sell out your oath? What does it mean to sell your religion? If we just reflect in our own lives what that could possibly mean. They sell out God's covenant and their own oaths for a small price, and they will have no share in the hereafter, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not speak to them nor look at them on the day of resurrection. Verse 77. Do we sell out our views for public approval? When we look at politicians, often we think that they've sold out in terms of their values. Are people selling out what they think just so that they can fit in with their group of friends? Do we sell out by doing what is haram to make an income? Do we sell out by pretending our views are something else other than what they are? When we compromise the religion for something else, then we are selling our religion for that thing. And when you think about it that way, it's a lot more jarring. It's a lot more off-putting. Nobody would willingly sell their religion for something else. But that's what happens when we take something, we put something over and above the religion itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues on and says, it is not appropriate for someone who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed with the scripture, wisdom and prophethood to say, worship me instead of Allah. Rather, he would say, be devoted to the worship of your Lord. So anyone who has religious knowledge, they should never say to the people, worship me, dedicate your time to me instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's completely inappropriate. Which sounds quite obvious, but then look at the society and look how that problem is rampant. Culturally, in our Indo-Pak culture, we still have an issue with peers. We still have an issue with religious leaders who happily have people completely and utterly devoted to them, who will happily instruct people to do certain things and will not allow people to think for themselves. who will happily say that this is my lineage that goes back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so you have to all listen to me. And when we look at the young people, this kind of celebrity Muslim culture, the full devotion, this is what this is. When we say the word worship, we think prostration, and then we think, well, I wouldn't worship anything else. Think about devotion. Think about if you are willing to obey something or someone else's opinion over and above what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandment is. That full devotion, that full submission, that level of authority is only reserved for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, there's another verse that goes, He would never command you to take angels and prophets as Lord. How could He command you to be disbelievers after you had devoted yourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So again, over and over again, these verses that seem to be about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are also about our relationships with other people, to not go to extremes. A lot of the time when we try to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a lot of people end up going through someone else who maybe is a little bit further along than they are. They take on a mentor, which is fine. The issue is when that mentor or that person becomes the sole authority for saying what's right and wrong, because they don't have that authority. And then we come to, it's an interesting few verses, verse 81 and 83. We have a test in humility, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes a pledge from the prophets, basically saying that I've given you the scripture, but if a messenger comes after you confirming what you have been given, you have to believe him and you have to support him. Do you pledge that you will do this? And they said, yes, we do. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing the prophets in a sense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is confirming with the prophets that although you are a prophet, if another prophet comes, you have to believe in him and you have to support him. And then we have a reminder of reality in verse 83. Do they seek anything other than submission to Allah? Everyone in the heavens and earth submits to him willingly or unwillingly. They will all be returned to him. So it's this idea that it doesn't even matter if you are a prophet. You must have a level of humility to submit whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to submit. And then the reality of the matter is that everything in the heavens and the earth ultimately submits to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, willingly or unwillingly. So that takes us up to the end of what we wanted to discuss today. I'll just quickly run through the appeal. Today's appeal is actually to do with orphans and widow care. So UK Islamic Mission does a lot of work abroad in terms of looking after orphans and widows. There's a lot of packages that you can give your money towards. You can sponsor an orphan, you can buy a small share in an orphanage, you can sponsor an entire family. So there are a lot of options depending on what you are able to give, inshallah. And so really that concludes our session for today. Jazakallah khair for coming today. I hope it was beneficial, and I hope that we could apply the things that we learnt today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. And we will be here again same time tomorrow, inshallah. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.